What if the most important thing a movie character can say is absolutely nothing? Aatami Korpi enters Sisu almost like he has already outlived the need for explanation. He is alone in the Lapland wilderness, digging through frozen earth with the patience of someone who has learned that the world does not reward desperation. There is no heroic introduction, no speech telling us who he is, no flashback explaining what he has suffered. We simply watch him work. Pick. Shovel. Dirt. Breath. Silence. And then, eventually, gold. That opening is deceptively simple because Jalmari Helander is making a very unusual gamble. He is asking you to become interested in a man before you know anything about him. In an era where blockbusters can spend 10 minutes explaining a character's childhood, trauma, bloodline, secret powers, and complicated relationship with an organization you have never heard of, Sisu does almost the opposite. It removes information and somehow creates mystery. The less Aatami tells us, the more we begin projecting onto him. You see the scars on his face and start wondering where they came from. You see the way he handles the earth and imagine how long he has been living this life. You notice that he carries himself without urgency, even though the world around him is collapsing into war, and suddenly his calm becomes more interesting than dialogue could have made it. Then the film introduces the Nazis, and the silence changes meaning. Aatami is not merely quiet because he is stoic. He is quiet because conversation has become unnecessary. There is nothing these men can say that he needs to hear. There is nothing he needs to explain to them. That distinction is crucial. Silence in most action movies is temporary. A hero stops talking because the scene is about to become physical. In Sisu, silence is practically the language of the protagonist. Aatami does not negotiate his identity through words. He demonstrates it through behavior. He digs when he needs money. He walks when the road is dangerous. He kills when he is cornered. He survives because survival is the only argument he still recognizes. And that is why the opening works so well as a psychological boundary. Before the violence begins, Helander establishes that Aatami exists on one side of ordinary human communication, while everyone else exists on the other. The Nazis talk constantly. They issue orders, threaten people, boast about themselves, and try to understand the strange old prospector who has suddenly become an obstacle. Their words create noise. Aatami's silence creates pressure. Every time someone asks him a question and receives almost nothing in return, the imbalance grows. You begin to understand that the film does not need Aatami to tell us what he feels because his body is already telling the story. He moves like a man who has spent years conserving energy. He does not perform toughness. He does not need to look intimidating. He simply continues. And when the film finally reveals the scale of what he is capable of, that restraint makes the violence feel even more explosive. This is one of the reasons the first act feels almost like a folktale. A man appears in an empty landscape carrying the possibility of something enormous inside him, and the movie deliberately refuses to explain exactly what that something is. You have to discover it through action. That is a dangerous storytelling method because it can easily become empty. A silent character can feel profound, or he can simply feel underwritten. Sisu spends much of its running time walking that line, and the reason it succeeds more often than it fails is that Aatami's silence is connected to the film's central cultural idea. But that silence isn't just an acting choice. It's the definition of a national identity that most of the world has never heard of, Sisu. To understand why Aatami can communicate so much without speaking, you have to understand what the word actually represents. Sisu is often translated into English with words like grit, courage, perseverance, determination, or resilience. But none of those translations quite capture it. The Finnish concept carries a particular sense of continuing after ordinary reserves of strength have been exhausted. It is not simply optimism. It is not the motivational poster idea that you can accomplish anything if you believe hard enough. Sisu is closer to the stubborn refusal to surrender when surrender would be easier, safer, and perhaps more rational. And that distinction is what makes the film's title so important. Aatami is not presented as a superhero. He does not have a magical ability that protects him from bullets, explosions, knives, or drowning. In fact, the movie repeatedly emphasizes how much damage his body can actually take. His power is not invulnerability. His power is continuation. That is a much older and stranger fantasy. Think about the difference between a character who says, "I can do this," and a character who simply keeps doing it. The first is expressing confidence. The second has stopped asking permission from reality. That is Aatami. He is not trying to convince the Nazis that he is stronger than they are. He does not care whether they believe him. He does not even seem particularly interested in proving himself. He wants his gold, and everything standing between him and that objective becomes another physical problem to solve. This is where Sisu turns a cultural concept into a narrative engine. Instead of using dialogue to explain Aatami's personality, the film turns every obstacle into a test of the concept itself. How much pain can he endure? How much blood can he lose? How far can he crawl? How creatively can he survive? At what point does the human body say no, and what happens when the mind refuses to accept the answer? The movie keeps returning to those questions, not through speeches but through increasingly outrageous situations. And because Helander has already established Aatami as a quiet, almost mythological figure, every new survival pushes him further away from ordinary realism and closer to legend. That is where the Finnish concept of Sisu becomes especially useful. It gives the movie a cultural vocabulary for something action cinema has been exploring for decades, the warrior who continues after everyone else would have stopped. But Sisu adds a fascinating complication. Aatami's endurance is not presented as cheerful. There is nothing inspirational about the way he carries himself. He is not smiling through adversity. He is not discovering a better version of himself. If anything, his strength feels exhausted. That makes his silence feel less like confidence and more like the residue of trauma. He has already experienced enough violence that another fight does not seem to shock him. He has become frighteningly comfortable with suffering. And that is why the movie's apparent simplicity becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. On the surface, Aatami is an action hero fantasy. Underneath, he is a man who has been reduced to survival. Sisu is therefore not just about toughness. It is about what toughness costs. The film rarely gives us direct access to that cost, but the absence itself matters. We never receive a conventional emotional monologue in which Aatami explains how the war changed him. Instead, Helander asks you to read the evidence written onto his body. The scars become sentences. The silence becomes biography. The gold becomes purpose. And the landscape becomes the only place where this man appears completely at home. That brings us to the genre hiding underneath the war movie disguise. Stop calling this a war movie. If you watch Sisu expecting a historical account of the Lapland War, you'll be disappointed. If you watch it as a spaghetti western, it becomes one of the best films of the decade. Because once you strip away the uniforms, tanks, mines, and historical setting, the skeleton of Sisu is unmistakably Western. A solitary prospector rides into an empty landscape. He discovers something valuable. A violent group wants to take it from him. There is almost no functioning social order around him. The landscape stretches endlessly in every direction. The protagonist has a mysterious past. The villains arrive like a roaming gang. And eventually, everyone converges on the same inevitable showdown. Replace Lapland with the American frontier and German soldiers with a gang of outlaws, and the structure barely changes. That is not a weakness. It is the key to understanding the movie. Helander is using history as the skin of a myth. The actual engine is Western storytelling. Aatami is the stranger who does not need to introduce himself because the frontier will introduce him for him. His reputation arrives late, after the violence has already started, and even then the details remain deliberately vague. We hear that he is dangerous. We learn that he has killed before. The Nazis gradually realize that they are not dealing with an ordinary miner. But the movie never pauses for a traditional origin story. Instead, his past becomes something other people are forced to imagine. This is exactly how Western legends work. The mysterious gunslinger does not explain every scar. The audience learns who he is through what happens when someone decides to challenge him. In that sense, Sisu belongs to the same storytelling tradition as the man with no name, even if Aatami is not a direct copy of that character. Both figures are defined by economy. They do not waste words. They do not waste movement. And most importantly, they do not need the approval of the society around them. They exist slightly outside the normal world. That outsider status gives them mythic power. The Western also depends on a particular relationship between the hero and the environment. Civilization is distant. Institutions are weak or absent. Justice is not something you can reliably call upon. If you want to survive, you have to rely on yourself. That is exactly the emotional architecture Helander creates in Lapland. The war is happening, but Aatami's immediate world feels almost post-apocalyptic. Roads are empty. Buildings are destroyed. Soldiers move through a landscape that seems indifferent to their ideology. The earth itself feels older than the conflict. And that matters because the Nazis are not really conquering this landscape. They are passing through it. Aatami belongs to it. That difference gives him an almost supernatural advantage. The soldiers have machines, weapons, numbers, and authority. Aatami has familiarity. He knows how to read the ground. He knows how to move without being seen. He knows what desperation looks like because he has lived with it. The movie's narrative becomes a simple collision between an organized force and an individual who cannot be organized. That is classic Western logic. What makes it especially effective is how little the film tries to complicate the premise. There is a temptation in modern cinema to explain everything. Every villain needs a motivation. Every hero needs trauma presented in dialogue. Every historical event needs a paragraph of exposition. Sisu often says, essentially, no. Watch. You can feel the story before you understand it. That is a risky choice, but it gives the film a speed that many larger action movies have forgotten. At 91 minutes, Sisu does not have time to become distracted by its own mythology. It builds the myth and then immediately tests it. That economy is part of its charm. You can criticize the film for being thin, and that criticism is fair. There are not layers and layers of political intrigue here. There is not a sprawling character ensemble. The historical premise is intentionally simplified. But simplicity is not automatically shallowness. Sometimes simplicity is a design choice. Helander understands that if the protagonist is supposed to feel like a force of nature, then giving him too much psychological explanation would actually weaken the effect. A hurricane does not need a backstory. A mountain does not need a motivation. A myth does not need a resume. Aatami simply arrives, and the movie asks whether you are willing to accept the legend. The genre framework provides the rules, but the environment provides the soul. To understand Aatami, we have to understand the frozen earth he walks on. Lapland is not merely a backdrop in Sisu. It is practically another character. The landscape is wide, empty, cold, and stripped of visual clutter, and that emptiness mirrors Aatami's internal world. There are no crowded cities to distract us, no warm interiors where characters can hide behind furniture and conversation, no busy streets filled with ordinary life. Instead, there is earth, snow, sky, smoke, and distance. The color palette reinforces that emotional isolation. Muted greens, browns, grays, and pale whites dominate the frame, creating a world that feels drained of comfort. When gold appears, it is almost shocking. Suddenly there is a color associated with warmth, wealth, desire, and sunlight. That contrast is not accidental. Gold becomes the only thing in the landscape that looks almost alive. It gives Aatami a reason to move through a world that otherwise seems designed to erase human presence. The cinematography also uses distance intelligently. Aatami is frequently positioned as a small figure inside enormous compositions. This makes him look vulnerable, but it also makes his persistence more impressive. The landscape could swallow him. Instead, he keeps crossing it. You watch him move through miles of empty terrain and understand that endurance is not just something he possesses physically. It is something the environment demands from him. That is one reason the film feels more like a myth than a conventional war thriller. The land itself becomes a test. There is something almost primordial about watching a lone figure drag himself across frozen ground after being shot, beaten, or burned. The question is no longer simply, can he defeat the next enemy? It becomes, can anything actually stop him? And because the film keeps returning to the same enormous landscape, each survival feels like another mark carved into a legend. Now consider how different this is from a typical modern action blockbuster. In a superhero movie, the hero's environment often exists to showcase power. Buildings explode because the hero is powerful enough to destroy them. Streets become stages for increasingly elaborate destruction. In Sisu, the environment often works against the hero. Mud slows him down. Water threatens him. Distance isolates him. Fire burns him. The ground can hide a mine or expose his position. The physical world has consequences. That is a major reason the movie's action feels tactile. You are not watching Aatami move through a digital playground. You are watching a body negotiate hostile matter. The cinematography understands that texture can create tension. Dirt under fingernails matters. Blood on skin matters. Boots sinking into mud matter. A rope tightening around a body matters. These details make the world feel tangible, and once the world feels tangible, the violence has something to push against. The landscape also contributes to the film's strange sense of time. The war is historically specific, but the environment feels ancient. You can almost imagine that the same ground existed before the Nazis arrived and will continue existing after they leave. That makes the conflict feel temporary in comparison. Human ideology becomes noise moving across a much older landscape. Aatami's connection to that landscape therefore contributes to his mythic status. He is not literally a supernatural creature, but the film repeatedly frames him as someone who understands the physical world better than the people trying to control him. The soldiers bring military hierarchy into a place that does not care about hierarchy. Aatami brings instinct. And when the two collide, instinct wins. But the most impressive part of Sisu's visual storytelling is that the landscape never feels like empty spectacle. Every major location contributes something to the action. The open minefield creates tension because there is nowhere to hide. The water creates a different survival problem. The tank creates a different kind of threat because Aatami's physical strength cannot simply overpower it. The landscape changes the rules. That is what good action cinema should do. A fight should not feel like the same choreography pasted into different backgrounds. The environment should determine what is possible. Sisu understands that principle instinctively. And once you notice it, you realize the movie's minimalism is not a lack of imagination. It is a concentration of imagination. There are fewer pieces on the board, so every piece matters more. Which brings us to the actual machinery of the movie, violence. We've watched the landscape isolate Aatami, but now we have to examine what happens when that isolation turns physical. The geometry of violence in Sisu is fascinating because the film is constantly balancing two contradictory ideas. On one side, the action is outrageous. Aatami survives injuries that would kill ordinary people. He performs feats that approach comic book territory. The movie clearly wants you to cheer. On the other side, the action is staged with enough physical texture that you can almost feel every impact. That combination is what keeps Sisu from becoming disposable spectacle. The violence is heightened, but it is rarely weightless. When Aatami falls, he hits something. When he is dragged, his body reacts. When he uses a weapon, the weapon has mass. When an explosion happens, debris moves through space. These things sound obvious, but they are increasingly important in an era when digital effects can make almost anything appear possible. If everything is possible, nothing feels dangerous. Sisu understands that danger depends on limitation. The hero has to struggle with gravity, friction, distance, exhaustion, and pain. Even when the movie eventually pushes those limits into myth, it establishes enough physical reality first that we accept the exaggeration. The action therefore has a strange rhythm. First comes the problem. Then comes the desperate solution. Then comes the consequence. Aatami does not simply overpower every enemy. He improvises. He hides. He uses the environment. He allows enemies to make mistakes. This makes his violence feel less like a demonstration of superiority and more like survival intelligence. That distinction matters because it keeps him sympathetic. You are not watching a god casually destroy insects. You are watching a damaged man find increasingly desperate ways to stay alive. The landmine sequences are a perfect example. The film turns explosives into both threat and opportunity. A mine is terrifying because it is invisible until it is activated, but Aatami learns to manipulate that danger. The same weapon that can destroy him can also become a tool against the soldiers. This is essentially the movie's entire philosophy in miniature. Take the thing designed to kill you and find a way to make it serve your survival. The choreography also benefits from restraint. Sisu does not constantly cut between 20 camera angles every second. Many moments are allowed to breathe long enough for you to understand the physical geography. That is crucial. Action becomes exciting when you know where everyone is. If you can see the obstacle, the weapon, the escape route, and the character's body, you can participate mentally in the sequence. You are not merely receiving impacts. You are solving the problem with the hero. That is why the film's action can feel surprisingly intimate despite its brutality. Aatami's body is always the center of the equation. You understand what he is trying to do because the movie shows you the problem. Then it lets you watch him solve it. This is also where the comparison with modern action choreography becomes useful. The John Wick model emphasizes mastery. John Wick enters a room and the audience watches an almost musical demonstration of technical competence. His movements are precise because he is one of the best fighters alive. Sisu works differently. Aatami is not elegant. He is efficient. Sometimes he is ugly. Sometimes he crawls. Sometimes he gets lucky. Sometimes he uses an absurdly practical solution because a beautiful one would not work. The choreography is therefore built around desperation rather than perfection. That makes the violence feel closer to survival horror than traditional martial arts spectacle. You are not thinking, "Look how cool that move was." You are thinking, "How is this man still alive?" That question becomes the movie's primary engine. And here's the key thing, the film knows exactly when to let that question become funny. Sisu is brutally violent, but it is also playful. The exaggeration eventually becomes part of the joke. Aatami's absurd resilience is so extreme that the film begins to treat his body almost like a dark comedy instrument. He is repeatedly pushed beyond what should be possible, and the audience starts anticipating the next impossible survival. That humor is essential because without it, the violence could become exhausting. The movie understands that myth and comedy often live close together. Once a hero becomes larger than life, there is something inherently funny about watching everyone else slowly realize the rules no longer apply to him. But the physicality also protects the movie from feeling completely cartoonish. The blood matters. The injuries matter. The dirt matters. The sound of metal against bone matters. The audience is allowed to enjoy the fantasy because the movie keeps reminding us that bodies are fragile. That tension is what makes the violence memorable. It is not merely choreography. It is storytelling through physics. And if you want to understand why the action works, you have to understand what happens when the film removes almost everything else. There are fewer conversations, fewer subplots, fewer locations, fewer characters. That means the physical sequences carry an enormous amount of narrative responsibility. Aatami's personality is revealed through the way he fights. His intelligence is revealed through his improvisation. His trauma is revealed through his willingness to endure pain. His relationship with the world is revealed through how he uses the environment. In another film, these qualities might be explained in dialogue. Here, they are encoded in movement. We've dissected how Aatami fights, but we need to talk about who he's fighting. Because in a story this focused, the villains are just mirrors for the hero's rage. Sisu's Nazi antagonists are intentionally simple. They are cruel, greedy, arrogant, and violent. They do not receive complicated ideological debates or elaborate psychological histories. And yes, if you approach the film as serious historical drama, that simplicity can feel thin. But if you understand the movie as a modern Western myth, their lack of depth becomes more defensible. Westerns traditionally use villains as obstacles that reveal the hero's character. The outlaw does not always need a 12-page backstory. He needs to represent the force standing between the protagonist and freedom. Sisu's Nazis perform a similar function. They represent organized brutality, entitlement, and the belief that violence gives you ownership over whatever you want. They see the gold and immediately understand it as something that can be taken. Aatami sees it as the reward for years of labor. That difference is enough for the story. The main antagonist, Bruno Heldorf, is effective precisely because he is theatrical. He has the confidence of a man who has spent too long believing his uniform makes him untouchable. He is not a philosophical monster. He is a bully with institutional power. And the film enjoys stripping that power away from him piece by piece. At first, his men surround Aatami. They have vehicles, guns, explosives, and numbers. But each encounter reveals that those advantages become less useful when confronted with someone who refuses to behave like a normal victim. Heldorf's frustration grows because he cannot categorize Aatami. Is he a soldier? A criminal? A civilian? A ghost? A man? The movie never fully answers. And that uncertainty makes the villain's perspective almost as important as Aatami's. Heldorf needs the world to make sense in terms of hierarchy. He expects orders to be obeyed. He expects violence to produce submission. He expects a wounded man to stay wounded. Aatami keeps breaking those assumptions. This is why a more complex villain might actually have weakened the story. Imagine giving Heldorf a sympathetic childhood, a detailed ideological crisis, and a philosophical conflict with Aatami. Suddenly the movie has to explain him. But the power of Sisu comes partly from refusing explanation. The Nazis are not there to create moral ambiguity. They are there to create pressure. Their cruelty makes the audience understand why Aatami's violence feels satisfying. That does not make the historical reality simple. It makes the movie's dramatic architecture simple. Those are different things. There is also a practical storytelling advantage to caricature. Because the villains are so clearly dangerous, the movie can move quickly. You do not have to pause to ask whether Aatami's actions are justified every 5 minutes. The emotional contract is established almost immediately. These men hurt civilians. They steal. They kill. They threaten. Aatami becomes the force that pushes back. That creates the fairy tale quality of the violence. The film is not trying to reconstruct every moral complexity of war. It is creating a revenge-adjacent fantasy about an old man who becomes impossible to kill. And yet there is an interesting contradiction here. The more simplistic the villains become, the more complicated Aatami can appear by comparison. He barely speaks, so we do not know exactly what is happening inside him. He is capable of extraordinary violence, but the movie does not present him as someone who enjoys cruelty. He simply does what he must do. The villains therefore function as a measuring device. They become progressively more monstrous while Aatami becomes progressively more mysterious. Their noise makes his silence stronger. Their desperation makes his patience stronger. Their desire for control makes his independence stronger. This is classic myth construction. The hero becomes legendary because the obstacles become impossible. And that brings us to one of the most important reasons the film works: the action feels like something that happened to actual bodies. The stunts feel real because they are real. But does that commitment to physical reality hold up when we look at the historical timeline of 1944? Before we answer that, we need to talk about how the movie creates its physical illusion. Sisu was made on a comparatively modest scale, and that limitation becomes an advantage. The film cannot compete with a giant studio production in sheer volume of spectacle, so it focuses on tangible details. Dirt, smoke, blood, vehicles, fire, weapons, costumes, locations, and stunt work all become important. The result is that even when the story becomes exaggerated, the images retain a tactile quality. You can feel the difference between an actor standing in a real environment and a digital character moving through an entirely synthetic one. The camera has something physical to photograph. Light interacts with real surfaces. Dust moves through real air. Water splashes against real bodies. Explosions create actual debris. Those details accumulate. None of them individually makes a film realistic, but together they create an atmosphere of physical credibility. And physical credibility is essential for Sisu because the entire premise depends on asking you to believe that Aatami's body can continue. If the environment already looks fake, his survival feels fake. But when the world feels tangible, his impossible endurance becomes a deliberate exaggeration inside a believable frame. That is a very old trick in genre cinema. The more grounded the world, the farther you can push the fantasy. A superhero movie can show a man flying because the movie establishes different rules from the beginning. Sisu does something more subtle. It establishes the rules of gravity, blood, fire, and pain, then asks how far one human being can violate those rules before you stop believing. That boundary is part of the fun. The practical approach also affects the rhythm of the action. Instead of relying entirely on digital spectacle, the filmmakers can build sequences around physical interaction. Aatami pulls something. Something resists. He falls. The camera catches it. He crawls. The ground becomes an obstacle. A tank moves through the frame with actual weight. These things give the film a sense of inertia. The action is not floating. It is happening to matter. This is especially important in an era when audiences have become extraordinarily sensitive to visual effects. We have seen enough digital destruction to recognize when a car has no physical weight. We have seen enough green screen environments to recognize when an actor is reacting to something that was not actually there. Sisu benefits from asking a simpler question: what if we just make the physical object real enough that the camera can trust it? The answer is not perfection. There are moments when the budget becomes visible. Some effects are more convincing than others. Some injuries are clearly heightened. Some sequences intentionally cross into comic book territory. But the film does not need every image to survive forensic analysis. It needs the overall sensory experience to remain coherent. And it does. The practical emphasis also connects directly to Aatami's character. He is a manual laborer. He digs. He carries. He cuts. He builds. He uses tools. His strength is expressed through contact with physical objects. It would be strange if his world suddenly became dominated by weightless digital effects. Instead, the filmmaking mirrors his personality. Everything has resistance. Everything has consequence. Everything has to be handled. That is one of the invisible pleasures of Sisu. The movie is about a man who believes in physical reality because physical reality is the only thing he trusts. Words can lie. Institutions can lie. Uniforms can lie. Propaganda can lie. But if a shovel hits the ground, it hits the ground. If a rope pulls tight, it pulls tight. If a bullet enters the body reacts. That material honesty becomes part of the film's worldview. Which is why the historical question becomes so interesting. The Lapland War was real. After Finland's changing relationship with Germany in 1944, Finnish forces fought German troops as German forces withdrew from northern Finland. The conflict produced enormous destruction, and German forces used scorched earth tactics during their retreat. Sisu takes that historical setting but does not attempt to become a conventional historical drama. The real events provide the time, uniforms, geography, and broad sense of danger. The protagonist and his near-mythical survival belong to another tradition. That distinction matters. If you watch Sisu expecting the movie to teach you the complete history of the Lapland War, it cannot do that. The film's relationship with history is closer to the relationship a Western has with the frontier. Historical reality establishes the atmosphere, but legend controls the plot. That is why criticism of the film's historical thinness is legitimate. There are real people and real events behind the setting, and turning that context into a playground for hyper-stylized violence can feel reductive. But it is equally important to judge the movie according to the kind of story it is actually telling. Helander is not pretending to have made a documentary. He is creating a myth inside a historical nightmare. The difference between those approaches should be clear to the audience. The film's title tells you where its priority lies. Sisu is not the name of a battle. It is the name of an idea. History supplies the battlefield. The idea supplies the hero. This is why the film can move from relatively recognizable wartime imagery into increasingly outrageous action without completely collapsing. It is not trying to remain inside the boundaries of military realism. It is moving toward folklore. And folklore has always borrowed from history without being controlled by it. The challenge is whether the transformation feels respectful enough to maintain emotional credibility. Sisu mostly gets away with it because it never asks us to confuse Aatami's legend with a literal historical account. The exaggeration is visible. The film's tone tells you that you are watching a cinematic fable. Yet that does not mean the historical context is irrelevant. In fact, knowing a little about the Lapland War makes the film more interesting because you understand what the movie is deliberately simplifying. The northern Finnish landscape was not an empty fantasy world. It was a place where war had devastating consequences. Roads, villages, infrastructure, and livelihoods were affected. German withdrawal caused extensive destruction in northern Finland. Against that background, the image of one man protecting a small fortune becomes a fantasy of individual survival inside a much larger catastrophe. Aatami cannot stop the war. He cannot save the country. He cannot rewrite history. He can only survive his corner of it. That limitation gives the story more emotional weight than it might initially appear to have. The gold is tiny compared with the scale of the conflict. One man's victory does not change the historical outcome. That is another reason the Western comparison works. Western heroes often exist at the edge of history. Great events happen around them, but their personal story remains small. Aatami is not a general. He is not a politician. He is not trying to change the course of the war. He is a prospector trying to leave with what he found. The historical machine is enormous, and he is one person trying to slip through it. That makes his survival feel almost absurdly personal. And that brings us inevitably to the comparison everyone makes. John Wick. It is easy to look at Aatami Korpi and immediately think of Baba Yaga. Both characters are nearly silent. Both possess terrifying reputations. Both appear ordinary until someone makes the catastrophic mistake of provoking them. Both transform from passive figures into unstoppable engines of violence. And both movies build their mythology by letting other characters talk about the hero before the hero fully demonstrates what he can do. But the comparison becomes more interesting when you ask what the two characters actually represent. John Wick is a professional. His mythology is built around mastery. He belongs to a secret criminal ecosystem with rules, currencies, hierarchies, hotels, contracts, and rituals. His violence is highly technical. He moves through combat like someone returning to a profession he understands better than anyone else. Aatami has almost none of that institutional mythology. He has no underworld network waiting to explain his status. There is no organization sending messages about him. There is no elaborate code of assassins. There is just a man in the wilderness and a growing pile of bodies. John Wick's legend expands because the world knows his name. Aatami's legend expands because the people trying to kill him cannot explain why he refuses to die. That is a subtle but important difference. John Wick is a myth within a society. Aatami is a myth outside society. Wick is the ultimate professional. Aatami is the ultimate survivor. Wick's violence often feels elegant because his competence is the point. Aatami's violence often feels desperate because his refusal to stop is the point. That is why calling Sisu finished John Wick is useful as a quick recommendation but inadequate as criticism. It tells you the surface. It does not tell you the movie's soul. The deeper connection is not choreography. It is myth. Both films understand that an action hero becomes more exciting when other characters are afraid of him before you fully understand why. The audience receives information indirectly. Someone says a name. Someone reacts to a scar. Someone recognizes a reputation. The hero remains quiet. Then the film demonstrates the truth behind the legend. This structure works because it lets anticipation become part of the action. You are not simply waiting for the fight. You are waiting to see whether the story everyone has heard is true. In John Wick, the answer is almost always yes. In Sisu, the answer becomes increasingly ridiculous. That ridiculousness is part of the film's personality. Sisu does not want to maintain the exact level of realism that John Wick sometimes pursues. It wants to become a tall tale. The more Aatami survives, the more the movie invites you to imagine him as something beyond ordinary human limits. And yet there is a fascinating emotional difference. John Wick wants something from the world. He wants peace. He wants the possibility of a life that was taken away from him. His violence is tied to grief and the destruction of a future he had hoped to build. Aatami's desire is much smaller on paper, gold. But the gold becomes emotionally complicated because it may represent more than wealth. It represents an exit. That is where Sisu becomes unexpectedly melancholic. Aatami Korpi isn't looking for revenge. He's looking for a way to stop existing. The gold is just the bait he uses to force his own ending. The film never states this in a conventional monologue, which is precisely why the idea is so powerful. Look at Aatami's behavior. He is not building an empire. He is not trying to become rich so he can enjoy luxury. He spends his time alone in the wilderness, digging. The gold is not really a destination. It is a possibility. A possibility that he can finish one last job and disappear. The tragedy is that every person trying to take the gold forces him back into the world he has already escaped. Survival becomes a punishment because every survival means he has to keep going. That is the emotional paradox hidden beneath the action. Normally, action heroes are rewarded for surviving. The audience cheers because survival means the protagonist gets another chance. In Sisu, survival can feel almost cruel. Aatami has already lost so much that you begin to wonder whether he even wants a normal future. His body has become a record of everything he has endured. He carries his past physically because he cannot seem to leave it behind. The film hints at a violent history without giving us the conventional flashbacks that would turn trauma into exposition. Again, the scars do the work. You look at him and understand that the man who exists now was made by things we do not fully see. That ambiguity allows different viewers to project different meanings onto him. Maybe he is a veteran. Maybe he has spent years fighting. Maybe he simply became hardened by the violence of his era. The movie does not insist on one answer. It gives you the shape of a trauma and lets your imagination fill in the details. This is where silence becomes emotional rather than merely stylistic. Atami's lack of dialogue stops being cool. It becomes sad. There is a difference between a character who has nothing to say and a character who has already said everything that matters through what he has survived. The film increasingly suggests the second. That is why his relationship with the gold matters. Gold is normally cinematic shorthand for greed. Someone finds treasure, and suddenly everyone wants it. But Atami is not greedy in the conventional sense. He is purposeful. He has spent years searching for something that can give him independence. The gold is freedom in physical form. And when the Nazis try to take it, they are not simply stealing money. They are once again taking control away from someone who has spent his life trying to escape control. This gives the conflict a deeper emotional structure without requiring the movie to explain it. Atami wants to leave. The world will not let him. Every time he thinks he has earned an exit, another obstacle appears. The gold therefore becomes almost ironic. The thing that promises freedom keeps creating more violence. The more valuable it becomes, the more people pursue him. And the more they pursue him, the more he has to become the terrifying figure they fear. His legend grows at exactly the moment he is trying to disappear. That contradiction is beautiful. The man wants anonymity, but survival makes him famous. He wants peace, but peace requires him to become violent. He wants to stop existing, but every impossible survival makes him more mythic. This is where the title begins to mean something beyond toughness. Sisu is not simply the ability to keep fighting. It can also be the curse of being unable to stop. Perseverance sounds heroic until you ask what happens when there is nothing left to persevere toward. Atami's body keeps answering the question with another survival, but emotionally, the film leaves open whether survival is actually what he wants. That gives the final stages of the story a strange sadness beneath the catharsis. You cheer when he wins because the villains deserve defeat. But you also understand that Atami's victory does not magically repair him. It does not erase his scars. It does not restore the years he lost. It simply gives him the gold and, perhaps, the possibility of choosing what happens next. That restraint is important. The film does not turn survival into a complete cure. It gives him an ending, not a new personality. And perhaps that is why the character stays in your mind after the credits. He is not memorable because he has the deepest dialogue. He is memorable because the movie leaves enough empty space for you to think about him. We have the myth, the history, and the craft. Now, let's look at the result. Does a film this simple have the weight to remain a classic? I think the answer depends on what you expect from the word classic. If you mean a film that completely reconstructs its historical period, develops every supporting character, explores the political complexity of the Lapland War, and gives us a psychologically exhaustive portrait of its protagonist, then Sisu is not that movie. Its premise is thin. Its villains are deliberately broad. Its historical context is more atmosphere than investigation. Its protagonist is intentionally mysterious to the point that some viewers will find him underdeveloped. Those are real limitations, and nostalgia should not require us to pretend they are not there. But if you mean a film that understands its own scale, executes its central idea with remarkable consistency, and reminds audiences how exciting simple cinematic storytelling can be, then Sisu has a very strong case. The film's greatest achievement is not any individual explosion or kill. It is discipline. Helander knows what the movie needs and, more importantly, what it does not need. It does not need a complicated mythology around Aatami. It does not need 10 subplots. It does not need a sprawling cast. It does not need constant jokes. It does not need to explain the title every 5 minutes. It needs a landscape, a mysterious protagonist, a simple objective, a group of terrible people, and a series of increasingly inventive obstacles. That is enough. In fact, adding more might have made the movie worse. This is where Sisu becomes a useful counterexample to modern franchise filmmaking. The contemporary blockbuster often operates under the assumption that bigger means more. More characters. More locations. More lore. More interconnected stories. More visual effects. More references. More runtime. Sometimes that abundance is wonderful. But abundance can also become noise. Sisu feels refreshing because it is almost aggressively uninterested in expansion. It knows exactly what it is. Aatami wants the gold. The Nazis want the gold. Everyone gets in the way. Go. That clarity creates momentum. You never wonder what the movie is trying to do. The question is only how creatively it can do it. That is an underrated quality. A film does not need to be complicated to be sophisticated. Sophistication can also mean understanding restraint. Think about the opening again. Aatami digs. That is it. But because the film does not rush through the moment, the digging becomes meaningful. We understand his patience. We understand the emptiness around him. We understand that he has spent a long time doing difficult work without anyone watching. The movie establishes character through duration. That is a cinematic decision. Likewise, the silence is not merely the absence of dialogue. It becomes a rhythm. When characters finally speak, speech feels louder because we have spent so much time without it. When violence begins, it feels louder because the film has first established stillness. Contrast is the secret. You cannot appreciate brutality without calm. You cannot appreciate noise without silence. You cannot appreciate a huge action moment without first giving the audience a small one. Sisu understands that instinctively. It also understands the value of an identifiable visual idea. Gold against dirt. A man against white snow. A tank against an open landscape. A scarred face against an empty background. These images are easy to remember because the film does not overwhelm them. Minimalism gives them room. The same principle applies to the score and sound design. The film knows that footsteps, breathing, metal, fire, and silence can carry emotional information. Sound becomes another way to make the physical world feel present. The absence of constant musical manipulation means the moments that do receive emphasis stand out more. Again, less becomes more. That does not mean every choice is perfect. Some tonal shifts are intentionally broad. Some sequences push plausibility far beyond what the grounded visual language initially promises. Some supporting characters function more as archetypes than people. The film can feel like a feature-length premise stretched across a series of increasingly elaborate action set pieces. But that criticism has to be balanced against the film's extraordinary consistency. It knows what kind of experience it wants to provide. It does not suddenly become a different movie halfway through. And consistency is harder than it looks. Many action movies begin with a strong premise and then bury it under exposition. Sisu begins with a simple premise and keeps stripping things away until the premise becomes myth. That is why the film can feel so satisfying even when its narrative architecture is extremely basic. You are not watching it because you need to discover a complicated mystery. You are watching because you want to see how far the central idea can go. How much can one man endure? How many times can the movie surprise you? How many different ways can the environment become a weapon? How much can silence communicate? Those are legitimate cinematic questions. And they are answered visually. That is perhaps the film's strongest argument for itself. Sisu does not ask you to admire it because it is complicated. It asks you to admire what happens when a filmmaker commits completely to one idea. Aatami becomes silence. Silence becomes endurance. Endurance becomes violence. Violence becomes legend. And legend becomes the story. That chain is remarkably clean. You can trace the entire movie through it. The final question is whether that simplicity will last. Some movies are entertaining for a weekend and then disappear. Others become part of your personal vocabulary. Sisu has the ingredients for the second category because its central image is so easy to remember: an exhausted, scarred Finnish prospector carrying gold through a landscape full of people who should have been able to kill him. That is a story you can summarize in one sentence and still make someone curious. More importantly, it is a character you can recognize immediately. You do not need to explain Aatami for 10 minutes. You show the face. You show the shovel. You show the blood. The audience understands. And maybe that is the final lesson of the movie. In a cinematic culture increasingly obsessed with explaining why characters matter, Sisu asks whether you can make someone matter simply by showing what they do. The answer is yes, but only if the filmmaking is confident enough to leave space around the character. Aatami works because Helander does not constantly interrupt him with explanations. The silence allows the audience to participate. You bring your own memories of action heroes. You bring your own understanding of survival. You bring your own ideas about what scars mean. The movie gives you an outline, and your imagination fills in the rest. That is why your nostalgia for a film like this makes sense even if you only discovered it recently. Nostalgia is not always about childhood. Sometimes it is nostalgia for a kind of cinema. A cinema where a simple premise could be enough. A cinema where a character did not need to belong to a universe. A cinema where 91 minutes could be a complete experience rather than the first chapter of a subscription obligation. Sisu feels almost rebellious because it understands the value of ending before the idea becomes exhausted. It does not need to tease 5 sequels. It does not need to build a franchise. It simply tells its story, pushes its hero to the edge, and stops. That is increasingly rare. And perhaps that is why its simplicity feels so satisfying. The legacy of Sisu is not going to depend on whether every viewer agrees that it is a masterpiece. It will depend on whether people remember how it made them feel. Remember the first time Aatami appears. Remember the moment the Nazis realize they have made a terrible mistake. Remember the minefield. Remember the water. Remember the tank. Remember that ridiculous, glorious feeling of watching a man who should be dead continue walking. Those images become the emotional shorthand of the movie. You do not remember Sisu because someone delivered a brilliant monologue. You remember it because the film gave you a series of images that lodged themselves in your imagination. And that brings us back to silence. The protagonist does not need to tell you that he is tired. You can see it. He does not need to tell you that he has suffered. You can see it. He does not need to tell you that he wants freedom. The gold tells you. He does not need to tell you that he is dangerous. The people around him tell you through their fear. And he does not need to tell you that he will keep going. The entire movie is proof. That is the art of brutal minimalism. It is not about removing details simply for the sake of being sparse. It is about identifying the few details that can carry everything else. A shovel. A scar. A handful of gold. An empty landscape. A Nazi convoy. A silent man. From those pieces, Helander builds a modern myth. Not a perfect myth, because the history underneath it is much more complicated than the film allows us to explore. Not a psychologically exhaustive myth, because Aatami remains deliberately opaque. But a cinematic myth. And sometimes that is enough. Because when you strip away the franchises, the exposition, the lore, the endless explanations, what remains is the oldest thing cinema knows how to do: show us a person facing an impossible obstacle and ask us to watch what happens next. Sisu understands that question better than most action movies do. It understands that violence can tell a story when movement has purpose. It understands that silence can create character. It understands that landscape can carry emotion. It understands that practical physicality can make fantasy feel believable. And most importantly, it understands that an audience does not always need more. Sometimes we need less. Less explanation. Less noise. Less mythology. Less spectacle for spectacle's sake. Give us one character. Give us one goal. Give us a world that wants him dead. Then let him walk. That is why Sisu works. Not because it is secretly a complicated masterpiece hiding beneath a simple action movie, and not because every weakness disappears when nostalgia enters the room. It works because its simplicity is intentional. It knows exactly what it wants to be, and it has the confidence to stop there. Aatami begins as a man digging alone in the dirt, almost invisible against the landscape. By the end, he has become something much larger, a story people will tell about the man who would not die. But the most human part of that legend is that beneath all the blood and impossible survival, he is still searching for the same thing he wanted at the beginning. A way out. A reason to stop. A little piece of freedom he can finally call his own. And maybe that is why we keep coming back to heroes like Aatami. Not because we literally want to become unstoppable killing machines, but because somewhere inside all of us is the fantasy of reaching the moment when the world has taken everything it can take, and we are still standing. We may not have his strength. We may not have his silence. We may never walk across a battlefield carrying gold through the frozen wilderness. But we understand the feeling. The feeling of being exhausted and continuing anyway. The feeling of having no perfect answer and choosing the next step regardless. That is Sisu. And when a movie can turn that feeling into 91 minutes of blood, snow, silence, and stubbornness, sometimes you do not need it to say anything else. You already understand. If the first part of Sisu is about discovering what Aatami Korpi can survive, the deeper question is what that survival actually means. Because the easiest way to misunderstand this movie is to look at the blood, the explosions, the absurd injuries, and the increasingly impossible escapes and conclude that Sisu is simply a celebration of invincibility. It is not. The fantasy is more uncomfortable than that. Aatami survives because he has learned how to live with pain, and the film slowly turns that ability into something that feels less like a superpower and more like a prison. That distinction is easy to miss when you are cheering through the action. And honestly, you should cheer. Sisu is designed to make you feel the ridiculous thrill of watching one man turn an entire military force into a collection of increasingly desperate mistakes. But once the adrenaline fades, another interpretation begins to emerge. What if Atami's greatest strength is also the thing that prevents him from returning to an ordinary life? What if the man who can survive anything has forgotten how to live for anything? That is where the film's minimalism becomes emotionally useful. Because Helander does not explain Atami's psychology in detail, you have to read him through repetition. He keeps walking. He keeps digging. He keeps getting hurt. He keeps refusing to stop. And eventually the pattern itself becomes a character study. Most action heroes have an emotional destination. They want revenge, redemption, justice, rescue, or freedom. Aatami wants something much quieter. He wants enough gold to walk away. That sounds simple, almost laughably simple, until you realize how little he asks from the world. He does not want power. He does not want recognition. He does not want anyone to remember his name. He wants to disappear. That desire makes his transformation into a legend strangely tragic. The more spectacular his survival becomes, the less likely anonymity becomes. Every impossible escape creates another story. Every enemy who survives long enough to describe him adds another piece to the myth. Aatami wants to vanish, but the movie keeps turning him into folklore. And that contradiction sits at the heart of the entire film. The world wants to make him a symbol. He wants to remain a man. You can feel that tension even when nobody says it aloud. The Nazis look at him and see an obstacle. The audience looks at him and sees a hero. The legend surrounding him suggests something supernatural. But Aatami himself behaves as though none of those identities matter. He simply wants to finish what he started. That is one reason his silence remains so powerful. If he delivered a long speech about his philosophy, the mystery would collapse. Instead, Helander allows other characters to react to him. Their fear becomes our explanation. Their confusion becomes our curiosity. Their inability to understand him becomes part of his mythology. This is an old cinematic trick, but Sisu applies it with unusual discipline. The protagonist is not made mysterious through hidden information alone. He is made mysterious through behavior. You do not know exactly what happened to him, but you know he has been hurt. You do not know every battle he fought, but you know he knows how to survive one. You do not know what he feels when he looks at his gold, but you can see that it represents something important. The film trusts you to connect those details. That trust is increasingly rare. Modern blockbusters often fear ambiguity because ambiguity can create uncertainty about whether the audience understands the story. So characters explain themselves. They announce motivations. They describe their trauma. They tell us what they are about to do. Sisu takes the opposite approach. It assumes that an audience can observe. And because the movie is so visually direct, that assumption pays off. Look at the way Aatami handles objects. He is not flashy. He does not move like a superhero posing for the camera. He handles things because they have practical uses. A knife is a knife. A shovel is a shovel. A rope is a rope. A tank is a problem. A mine is a problem. The question is always how the physical world can be manipulated. This makes Aatami's intelligence visible without making him verbally analytical. He is constantly calculating. Where is the enemy? Where is the escape route? What can be used as a weapon? What can absorb impact? What can hide movement? What can create leverage? That is why the action feels satisfying. You are watching a mind work through a body. The violence is not random. It is problem solving. And that brings us back to the Western structure. The great Western hero is often defined by practical intelligence. He understands terrain. He knows when to draw. He knows when not to draw. He knows how to survive with limited resources. The frontier punishes waste. Sisu inherits that logic and pushes it into wartime territory. Aatami is a prospector, which is important. He is not introduced as a soldier. He is introduced as a worker. His relationship with violence is therefore initially surprising. He has spent his life digging rather than conquering. That makes the contrast between his peaceful labor and his later brutality more striking. The gold he finds is the product of patience. The violence surrounding it is the product of interruption. In other words, Aatami does not seek the war. The war finds him. That distinction helps the audience accept his violence because his original desire is so modest. He is not hunting enemies. He is trying to leave. Every escalation is forced upon him. That does not make the violence morally simple, but it makes the dramatic structure clean. Aatami becomes dangerous because people refuse to let him be left alone. And there is something deeply satisfying about that fantasy. You have probably felt some version of it in ordinary life, even if obviously not at this scale. The fantasy of being left alone. The fantasy of finishing your work, taking what you earned, and walking away from everyone else's chaos. Sisu takes that universal desire and turns it into an action movie. The joke is that Aatami is surrounded by people who absolutely will not let him have peace. So peace becomes the most violent thing he has to fight for. That is why the gold matters beyond its monetary value. It is not merely treasure. It is an exit ticket. It represents the possibility that Aatami can finally choose his own future instead of reacting to someone else's violence. The Nazis do not understand that. They see only value. That is part of their villainy. They reduce everything to possession. Land, people, gold, authority. If they can take it, they believe they have the right to take it. Aatami's resistance therefore becomes more than self-defense. It becomes a refusal to be possessed. That theme is especially powerful when placed against the historical setting. Finland in 1944 was experiencing a violent political and military transition, and the Lapland War emerged from a complicated shift in alliances. Finland had previously fought alongside Germany against the Soviet Union, but after the Finnish-Soviet armistice, German forces became enemies as they withdrew from northern Finland. The historical reality was messy, tragic, and destructive. Sisu deliberately does not reproduce that complexity in detail. Instead, it uses the historical situation as pressure around a personal story. This is where the film's relationship with history deserves a balanced judgment. It would be unfair to demand that every fictional action movie become a complete historical seminar. But it would also be unfair to pretend that historical settings are meaningless decorations. They carry real memories. When filmmakers use them, they inherit some responsibility for how those memories are represented. Sisu chooses myth over documentation. That is artistically coherent, but it limits what the film can say about the actual conflict. If you want a nuanced understanding of the Lapland War, this is not where you should stop researching. If you want a modern Finnish revenge western wearing the clothing of that war, Sisu knows exactly what it is doing. And perhaps that is why the movie has generated such a strong response among viewers who were not necessarily looking for historical accuracy in the first place. It gives you a cinematic experience that feels refreshingly self-contained. There is no homework required before you press play. You do not need to remember 12 previous films. You do not need to understand a fictional universe. You do not need to know every political faction. The movie establishes its rules and gets moving. That simplicity can feel almost radical. Think about how many modern action films spend their first 30 minutes preparing you for another movie. They introduce organizations, artifacts, villains, secret histories, future sequels, and interconnected characters. Sisu spends its opening building one thing, Aatami. And because the film invests so heavily in him, every later action beat feels connected to the same central question. How far can this man go? The answer keeps getting larger. First he seems merely tough. Then he seems exceptionally skilled. Then he seems almost impossible to kill. Eventually the distinction between man and myth begins to disappear. That progression is not accidental. It is the movie's structure. Sisu is essentially a legend being written in real time. The audience watches the reputation form. We see the evidence. We understand the exaggeration. We become participants in the myth. And this is where the film's humor becomes particularly important. If Sisu played every survival completely straight, the movie could become exhausting or unintentionally silly. Instead, Helander understands that the audience needs permission to laugh at the absurdity. Aatami's resilience becomes a running joke because everyone around him expects normal human limits. He gets injured, and you expect him to collapse. He gets trapped, and you expect the trap to work. He enters another impossible situation, and you begin wondering what new piece of physical logic he will exploit. The movie knows you are thinking that. It plays with your expectations. That is why the action feels like a tall tale. The point is not whether every survival could happen exactly as shown. The point is whether the story has earned the right to exaggerate. By the time Sisu reaches its wildest moments, you have already accepted the premise that Aatami is different. The film has bought its exaggeration through consistency. That is an important lesson in action filmmaking. Spectacle does not automatically create excitement. Context creates excitement. If a character survives an impossible fall in the first 5 minutes, the audience may simply shrug. If that same character has spent an hour establishing physical intelligence, resilience, and tactical creativity before surviving the impossible fall, the audience reacts differently. We have learned the rules. We have watched them bend. We are now willing to see them break. Sisu understands this escalation better than many larger films do. The action grows not merely in size but in improbability. The stakes become increasingly ridiculous, but the emotional objective remains constant. Aatami wants to get away. That constant objective is what keeps the movie coherent. No matter how insane the action becomes, you understand why he is still moving. He is not fighting because the screenplay needs another fight. He is fighting because something is still between him and freedom. That distinction is subtle but important. It is the difference between action as narrative and action as decoration. In Sisu, the violence advances the story because every fight changes Aatami's relationship with the people pursuing him. His reputation grows. Their desperation grows. His physical condition deteriorates. Their willingness to use increasingly extreme methods increases. The movie keeps escalating naturally because every action creates a reaction. And then there is the visual design of the violence. Sisu often uses wide compositions that allow you to understand where bodies are in relation to the landscape. That creates a satisfying sense of geography. You can see the minefield. You can see the road. You can see the tank. You can see the distance between Aatami and his enemies. The film does not always hide the mechanics of the stunt. It often lets you watch the physical solution develop. That makes the viewer feel intelligent. You are not being manipulated through confusion. You are being invited to understand. This is one reason the film can feel so tactile despite its outrageous premise. The camera respects the physical world. It gives space to movement. It lets objects have weight. And when something goes wrong, the consequences are visible. This approach also separates Sisu from the sleekness of John Wick. John Wick is choreography as performance. Sisu is choreography as survival. There is beauty in both approaches, but they produce different emotional responses. Watching John Wick fight can make you admire technical perfection. Watching Aatami fight can make you admire stubbornness. One says, "Look how skilled this person is." The other says, "Look how impossible it is to stop this person." That difference explains why the two characters can coexist in the same cultural conversation without being identical. They satisfy different action fantasies. Wick represents mastery. Aatami represents endurance. Wick is a machine that knows exactly what it is doing. Aatami is a wounded human being who refuses to shut down. And that human quality becomes more important as the movie progresses. The longer Aatami survives, the more you notice the cost. His movements become increasingly battered. His body carries more evidence of the journey. The film does not allow his injuries to disappear between scenes. That continuity matters. It tells us that survival has consequences. In many action movies, the hero can be shot, thrown through a window, slammed into a wall, and then walk into the next scene looking almost untouched. Sisu is more attentive to physical continuity. Aatami accumulates damage. He becomes more battered as the story continues. That makes his eventual survival feel earned even when it is exaggerated. The body remembers what the narrative could otherwise forget. This is where the practical effects and stunt work become more than technical achievements. They support character. If you can see the damage, you can feel the journey. Aatami's body becomes a visual timeline. At the beginning, he is already scarred. By the end, he is almost a map of everything the film has thrown at him. The audience does not need a montage explaining his suffering. The evidence is right there. And that is exactly what brutal minimalism means when it works. You do not remove information. You compress it. One scar can replace a flashback. One look can replace a speech. One action can replace a paragraph of explanation. One landscape can replace an entire conversation about isolation. The best minimalism is not emptiness. It is density. Every element has to carry more weight because there are fewer of them. That is why Sisu's weaknesses become more visible as well. When a movie removes so much, whatever remains has to be strong. The supporting women, for example, receive less development than some viewers might want. Their presence is important to the story, but the film's emotional focus remains overwhelmingly on Aatami. That reinforces the mythic structure, but it also narrows the world. We understand Aatami very clearly through action, while other characters remain closer to functions within the plot. Again, that is not necessarily a mistake. It is a trade-off. Every artistic decision gives something and takes something away. Sisu gains momentum by limiting character development. It gains mystery by limiting exposition. It gains mythic power by sacrificing historical detail. It gains visceral impact by focusing heavily on physical action. The question is whether those trade-offs are worth it. For me, they mostly are. But acknowledging the cost is what keeps the analysis honest. You can love a film without pretending it is perfect. In fact, loving it enough to examine its limitations is a more meaningful form of appreciation. Nostalgia often asks us to protect our favorites from criticism, but criticism does not have to be an attack. Sometimes it is simply another way of looking closely. And Sisu rewards close looking because its craft is often hidden under the spectacle. Take the editing. The film moves quickly, but it rarely feels frantic for the sake of being frantic. The cuts are usually serving physical clarity. We understand the action because the editing supports the geography. This is especially important in sequences where multiple threats exist at once. A weaker film might cut rapidly to create artificial excitement. Sisu often creates excitement by letting you understand the problem. That difference is huge. If you know where the danger is, anticipation becomes part of the experience. You can see the mine. You can see the approaching soldiers. You can see the obstacle. You begin imagining the solution before Aatami finds it. Then the film surprises you by choosing a different solution. That creates participation. You are not simply watching. You are predicting. And prediction is one of the basic engines of cinematic pleasure. The audience forms a hypothesis, and the film either confirms it or breaks it. Sisu repeatedly breaks it. You think Aatami is trapped. He escapes. You think he is finished. He moves. You think the tank has won. He finds another angle. You think the water will kill him. It becomes another environment to manipulate. The movie turns survival into a series of problems, and each solution becomes another piece of the myth. This is also why the film's title works so well internationally. Sisu is a Finnish word, but the movie does not require you to speak Finnish to understand the emotion behind it. You may not have an exact translation, but you can recognize the behavior. You know what it means to continue when you are tired. You know what it means to keep working when motivation disappears. You know the difference between feeling strong and simply refusing to quit. That universality is important. The film uses a culturally specific concept but expresses it through physical storytelling that almost anyone can understand. That is why the word can remain untranslated without becoming inaccessible. You do not need a dictionary definition after watching Aatami survive. The movie demonstrates the concept. In fact, perhaps the best way to explain Sisu is not through a sentence but through an image. A man who should be dead gets up. He looks around. He keeps walking. That is Sisu. It is not glamorous. It is not necessarily healthy. It is not even always wise. It is simply the refusal to surrender. And that ambiguity makes the concept more interesting than the English words we usually use for it. Grit can sound inspirational. Resilience can sound therapeutic. Determination can sound corporate. Sisu feels harder. It carries the idea of finding an additional reserve after you have already reached what you thought was your limit. That is why it fits Aatami so perfectly. His body has already reached its limit several times. His mind refuses to accept that limit. But there is also danger in romanticizing that idea. A culture of endurance can become a culture of silence. If strength means never admitting weakness, then suffering can become invisible. Aatami is compelling partly because the film shows us what happens when a person has become almost entirely endurance. There is little softness left. Little room for vulnerability. Little evidence that he expects help from anyone. He survives, but we cannot confidently say that he is happy. That is an important distinction. Survival and happiness are not synonyms. A person can be extraordinarily resilient and deeply unhappy. A person can be strong and exhausted at the same time. Sisu does not spell this out, but the possibility is there in Aatami's face. He does not look like a man enjoying his adventure. He looks like a man completing an obligation. That makes the gold more poignant. It may be the first thing he has wanted for himself in a very long time. Not revenge. Not glory. Not approval. Something concrete. Something that can be carried away. Something that can buy distance. The tragedy is that the world keeps forcing him to prove that he deserves it. And perhaps that is why the final emotional effect of Sisu is more complicated than simple triumph. You feel victorious because Aatami survives. But you also feel the exhaustion of having watched him survive. There is no easy sense that everything is now fixed. The war is still bigger than him. The scars are still there. The past is still inside him. The gold cannot change what happened before he found it. It can only give him a little control over what comes after. That is a very modest ending for a movie with such enormous action. And that modesty is part of its strength. The movie does not need to tell us what Aatami does with the rest of his life. It is enough to know that, for once, he has a choice. That brings us back to the idea of the modern Western. The Western often ends when the hero has completed the journey and can finally move on. Sometimes he rides into the sunset. Sometimes he walks away from civilization. Sometimes he remains outside the society he helped save. Aatami belongs to that tradition because his reward is not integration. It is independence. He does not want to become part of the system. He wants to leave it. The gold gives him the ability to choose his own direction. In that sense, the movie's ending is not really about wealth. It is about agency. Aatami spends the entire film reacting to forces trying to control him. By the end, he has reclaimed control. That is a more satisfying interpretation of the treasure. And it also explains why the villains are so important. They represent systems of control. They arrive with uniforms, vehicles, weapons, commands, and hierarchy. Aatami has almost none of those things. He has himself. That makes his eventual victory feel like an individualist fantasy, but it also gives the film a political undertone without requiring a political speech. The man with nothing defeats the people who believe possession gives them power. Again, the story is simple. But simple does not mean meaningless. Myth has always worked through simple contrasts. The hero and the monster. The traveler and the gatekeeper. The treasure and the thief. The wilderness and civilization. Sisu simply gives those ancient oppositions guns and tanks. And that is why its Western DNA is so important. If you watch it as a realistic war film, the exaggeration may frustrate you. If you watch it as a fairy tale for adults, the exaggeration becomes the point. The Nazis become monsters. Aatami becomes a legend. The landscape becomes a magical wilderness. The gold becomes a symbolic object. The action becomes ritual. And suddenly the film's simplicity feels deliberate rather than incomplete. This is also why the movie can be discussed alongside films that operate in completely different tonal registers. Think about Mad Max, Kill Bill, John Wick, or even older spaghetti westerns. These movies are not realistic in the ordinary sense. They create heightened worlds where character traits become physical laws. Revenge becomes an engine. Skill becomes almost supernatural. Violence becomes choreography. Identity becomes costume. Sisu belongs to that tradition. It does not ask whether Aatami could survive every event exactly as shown. It asks whether the audience is willing to believe in the legend for 91 minutes. And the answer, for most viewers who connect with the movie, is yes. The secret is commitment. Helander never seems embarrassed by the premise. He does not wink at the audience every 5 minutes to reassure us that he knows it is ridiculous. He simply keeps going. That confidence matters. A film can be absurd and still feel serious if the filmmakers take the emotional rules seriously. Sisu takes Aatami's desire for freedom seriously. It takes the physical consequences seriously. It takes the historical setting seriously enough to create atmosphere, even if it does not explore it deeply. The exaggeration happens within those boundaries. That is why the tone holds together. And if you have ever wondered why some low-budget genre movies feel more exciting than expensive blockbusters, this is part of the answer. Money can buy scale. It cannot buy focus. A huge production can put thousands of digital objects on screen and still feel empty. A smaller production can put one exhausted man in a field and make you care about whether he reaches the other side. The difference is not necessarily budget. It is intention. Sisu knows what it wants you to look at. It knows what it wants you to feel. It does not divide your attention among 20 narrative obligations. That concentration creates intensity. The film is lean because the story is lean. And the story is lean because the protagonist is defined by one desire. Get the gold. Get out. Survive. Those verbs are enough. The action grows from them naturally. This is the kind of filmmaking that can feel almost old-fashioned in the best possible way. There is a beginning. There is a problem. There is escalation. There is a climax. There is an ending. No homework. No universe. No requirement to watch another movie to understand why a character matters. Just a story. That does not make Sisu superior to more complicated filmmaking. Complexity has its own pleasures. But it makes Sisu a useful reminder that simplicity itself can be sophisticated when it is controlled. And perhaps that is the strongest legacy the movie can leave behind. Not a franchise. Not a cinematic universe. Not a collection of sequel hooks. An example. An example of what can happen when filmmakers trust a premise enough to stop adding things. You can build an entire action movie around one character, one landscape, and one idea. You can create tension without constant dialogue. You can create mystery without elaborate mythology. You can create emotional depth without explaining every wound. You can create a memorable villain without giving him a sympathetic childhood. You can create spectacle without depending entirely on digital destruction. And you can make a film that respects the audience enough to let them connect the dots. That is why Sisu feels refreshing. It is not necessarily the biggest action movie. It is not necessarily the deepest historical movie. It is not even necessarily the most realistic. But it is unusually confident about what it is. And confidence is contagious. You feel it in the opening silence. You feel it when Aatami refuses to speak. You feel it when the first fight explodes into violence. You feel it when the landscape becomes a weapon. You feel it when the Nazis begin to realize they have made a catastrophic mistake. You feel it every time Aatami stands back up. The movie keeps asking the same question in different forms: how much can a person endure before they stop being a person and become a story? By the end, Aatami has crossed that line. He is still human, but everyone around him treats him like a legend. That is the final transformation. Not from weak to strong, but from unknown to mythic. The strange thing is that Aatami never seems to want that transformation. He never asks to be remembered. He never gives a speech celebrating his accomplishments. He never stands before a crowd demanding recognition. He just keeps moving. That makes the legend feel almost accidental. The world creates the myth because it cannot explain the man. And perhaps that is the best possible ending for a character built around silence. We never get a definitive explanation of Aatami Korpi because the film understands that explaining him would make him smaller. Mystery is part of his power. His past remains partly hidden. His future remains open. His motives are simple but emotionally rich. His body tells us more than his words could. And the gold gives him the one thing he has been fighting for all along, the possibility of choosing when the story ends. That is why Sisu stays with you. Not because every scene is flawless. Not because the historical premise is comprehensive. Not because the action has reinvented cinema. It stays because it remembers something fundamental about movies. A character can become iconic through behavior. A landscape can become emotional through composition. A word can become meaningful through action. A 91-minute film can feel larger than a 3-hour franchise entry if every minute knows why it exists. And sometimes the most powerful thing a hero can do is refuse to explain himself. So when you remember Sisu, remember the spectacle, absolutely. Remember the blood, the mines, the fire, the tank, the gold, and the ridiculous survival. Those moments deserve to be celebrated. But also remember the quieter details. The sound of the shovel entering the earth. The empty horizon. The exhausted face. The pauses between attacks. The way Aatami keeps moving even when there is no reason to believe he should be able to. Those are the moments where the movie reveals what it really is. Beneath the action film is a western. Beneath the western is a myth. Beneath the myth is a man who wants to be left alone. And beneath that man is an idea that audiences everywhere can understand. Sometimes life does not give you a heroic speech. Sometimes it does not give you a clean victory. Sometimes you simply reach the point where you have nothing left, and somehow you find one more step. One more breath. One more reason to continue. That is the emotional core of Sisu. It is not about becoming invincible. It is about discovering what remains when everything else has been taken away. Aatami loses blood. He loses safety. He loses anonymity. He loses the possibility of an easy escape. But he refuses to lose agency. And that is why his survival feels cathartic. He is not surviving because the universe has chosen him. He survives because he keeps choosing himself. In a culture overflowing with superheroes who are defined by powers, franchises, origin stories, and endless explanations, there is something strangely powerful about a man with a shovel who barely speaks. He does not need a universe. He needs a direction. He does not need a catchphrase. He needs a reason to keep walking. He does not need anyone to believe in him. He simply needs to take the next step. And maybe that is why the word Sisu has traveled so effectively beyond Finland. Because the concept is culturally specific, but the feeling is universal. Every generation has moments when ordinary strength runs out. Every person eventually reaches some version of that boundary. The question is what happens next. Sisu offers one answer. You continue. Not because you are fearless. Not because you are untouched by pain. Not because you know you will win. You continue because stopping is not an option yet. That is a much more honest kind of heroism. And it is also why the movie's brutality never completely overwhelms its humanity. Beneath every impossible stunt is a simple emotional desire, freedom. Aatami wants the freedom to finish his work. The freedom to keep what he earned. The freedom to leave. The freedom to exist without someone else deciding his fate. The villains cannot understand that because they see power differently. They believe freedom comes from controlling others. Aatami discovers it by refusing to be controlled. That conflict is larger than the plot, even if the movie never announces it. And perhaps this is where the film becomes more than just a cool action flick. It becomes a small argument for restraint. For self-containment. For the idea that you do not need to conquer everything to reclaim your life. You just need enough space to make your own choices. The gold buys that space. The silence protects it. The landscape gives it room. And Atami's endurance gets him there. That is the complete circle. He begins digging into the earth because he wants something buried beneath it. He ends by carrying that discovery through a landscape that seems determined to destroy him. Along the way, he becomes the very thing the film's title describes. Not a superhero. Not a soldier. Not a conventional action hero. Sisu. A man who has reached the end of his strength and somehow found more. And if that sounds simple, it is. But simple ideas can be the hardest ones to execute well. Sisu executes this one with enough confidence, craft, humor, violence, and visual intelligence to make the simplicity feel like a strength rather than an apology. That is why the movie deserves to be remembered. Not as the Finnish John Wick. Not merely as a historical war movie. Not simply as a 91-minute bloodbath. But as a modern myth about endurance. A film that looked at an exhausted man in an empty landscape and decided that silence could be louder than dialogue, that practical violence could be more exciting than digital excess, and that one clearly defined idea could carry an entire movie. In the end, Aatami does not need to tell us who he is. The film has already shown us. He is the man who keeps going. And sometimes, that is enough.